Hi there, students. This is pronunciation exercise number 22. Okay, this one is going to be you had, not would, but you had. Okay, you had a and the different ones. Okay, so just listen to me and try and copy what I say, okay? So here's the first one. You'd had a long trip. You'd had a long trip. You'd had a long trip. Okay? You'd had an overseas trip. You'd had an overseas trip. You'd had an overseas trip. Okay? You'd had the most interesting trip. You'd had the most interesting trip. You'd had the most interesting trip. Okay? You'd had the overland trip. You'd had the overland trip. Okay? Yeah? The overland or the overland. Notice in all of these, the had is receiving quite a lot of pronunciation. Notice that you'd hadda. But here it's because had is the main verb. Okay, let's look at the negatives. You hadn't had a long trip. You hadn't had a long trip. So, you hadn't had. You hadn't had a long trip. Okay? You hadn't had an overseas trip. You hadn't had an overseas trip. You hadn't had an overseas trip. And the next. You hadn't had the most interesting trip. You hadn't had the most interesting trip. Okay, notice the, very soft. And the next. You hadn't had the overland trip. You hadn't had the overland trip. Okay, or the overland trip. Okay, now the questions. Had you had a long trip? Had you had a long trip? Okay, had. Notice here, this has gone to our schwa sign. Had. Had you had a long trip? Had you had a long trip? Okay, had you had. Okay, had you had. And the next one. Had you had an overseas trip? Had you had an overseas? Had you had an overseas trip? And the next one. Had you had the most interesting trip? Had you had the most interesting trip? Okay. And the last one. Had you had the overland trip? Had you had the overland trip? Okay. The overland or the overland. And again, had you had. So, there you've got it. So, just try and copy the sounds that I've made. Yeah? Because these are the sounds that people really make when they speak. I'm just going to read these again. You'd had a long trip. You'd had an overseas trip. You'd had the most interesting trip. You'd had the overland trip. You hadn't had a long trip. You hadn't had an overseas trip. You hadn't had the most interesting trip. You hadn't had the overland trip. Had you had a long trip? Had you had an overseas trip? Had you had the most interesting trip? Had you had the overland trip? And that's how it goes. Anyway, give it a rating if you enjoyed it, and I'll see you soon. Bye for now.